Hello, my name is Neil Rose. I'm the editor of Legal Futures, and I'm here with Nick West, the director of legal markets at LexisNexis, to discuss Pressure Points, a study of the changing legal services landscape, the latest survey produced by the company. Nick, the first finding in the survey, which is of 101 largely commercial law firms, is that 66% of them are pretty confident about their growth over the next 2 years. Is that confidence or is that complacency?
Good question. I think I was pretty surprised by reading that statistic, I have to say. It's not an easy market out there with the state of the economy, the rise in buyer power, sort of behaviours of General Counsel and the Legal Services Act. But then, thinking about it, reported results this year from bigger firms have been good, driven by international expansion, driven by domestic mergers and so on. So yeah, I think we're probably getting to a point where maybe some of the pessimism is played out and there is a future ahead that people can see.
Or is this just the death rattle, or the last knockings, shall we say, of the old law firm model, and they're still managing to squeeze something out of it, but longer term, as we'll get on to discuss, things might have to change?
I'm sure that things have to change. I'm sure. I think I can see how the future doesn't look perhaps as bleak as the last 2 or 3 years has been, when that was such a shock to the system. People are resetting what's normal, the new normal, that sort of phrase that's oft used, and perhaps can see some growth out there.
The survey, perhaps unsurprisingly, identified competition as the biggest threat to firms, or firms identified it, particularly new entrants coming into the market. It says here under the ABS model. Are they right? I mean, are the largest firms really got that much to worry about at the moment from new entrants?
I think everyone's got something to worry about from new entrants. I think new entrants really means as you've referred to already, a big change in the sort of legal market. I suspect the top 10 or 20 firms aren't necessarily sort of in the line of fire from ABSs, although even sort of the likes of Irwin Mitchell are thinking about that as a structure. But I do think that firms 50 to 200 or 100 to 200, I think that is an area that some of these ABSs can play in. Take quality solicitors as a good example, and whilst it's often thought about as picking up firms in the region, small firms, they are bringing to bear an awful lot of marketing spend. I think it's £15 million they've spent on their Saatchi advertising campaign. £15 million is bigger than the majority of the firms in this market. I mean, the majority of the revenue they make, I think it's some sort of firm number 120 that makes that much money. So I think even the likes of quality solicitors are going to be pushing at some of the bigger firms in our market before long.
But we're not expecting to see an advert for Freshfields during X Factor.
I think we'd have to talk to their marketing director, but it doesn't strike me as being the obvious thing. But you say that, but these are firms who are advertising in sports fixtures and all sorts of things that they never used to do, right? Freshfields just sponsored the Olympics, didn't they?
Well, indeed, yes. One thing I was sort of finding that surprised me was that they seem to be not too worried, relatively speaking, about more work being retained in-house. Did that surprise you? Absolutely.
For me, I think that is the fundamental shift in the market at the top end, at these kind of commercial firms. General Counsel are changing their behaviour, and where they used to give their work out essentially to one firm or a small panel, they're now really assessing whether they need to do the work in the first place, or whether they can insource it, or whether if they are going to give it out, whether they need to give it to such a big premium firm, or whether they can give it to a cheaper firm out of London, overseas, offshore, whatever it might be. So yeah, I think I was quite surprised by that finding too, that it ranked so low as a threat. Because for me, I think it's the underpinning of an awful lot of the other things that are changing.
I mean, might this be where the ABS threat comes in, that the report talks a fair amount about Riverview Law, and as an alternative and a different model for General Counsel, that if they are going to outsource, maybe they'll look to a new model that gives them a new way of doing it.
I think that is a very good point, and actually it ties into something towards the end of the report about fixed fee pricing, doesn't it? And I think that firms really getting to grips with how to price on a fixed fee basis, given their legacy infrastructure, that is very, very difficult. And I'm sure that, like most buyers of anything want certainty of price. And I think General Counsel are pretty typical of that. And I think firms like Riverview or anyone else that can play with that model successfully, I think will have a real edge in the market.
Let's move on to the next part of the survey about strategic needs and strategies that these law firms are identifying as how they're going to increase their profits. There's a lot of talk here about delegation, whether down to associates or paralegals or even offshore. Is this showing that the traditional law firm pyramid model is going to change shape?
Again, yes, I think so. I mean, I'd be surprised if we're looking at similarly structured law firms across the market in a few years' time. I think there are going to be paralegals much more prevalent. I think you're going to have business process analysts in firms who are trying to really understand how legal process works. I think it's undeniable that firms are going to look different in a few years' time.
But how much of this at the moment, at least, is just about margin? And how much of it is about actually firms looking at their structure and rethinking it?
I think it's a lot about margin for the moment. But I think in the future, I think if one looks outside of the law, every single industry has had to grapple with questions about how to do more for less, with less. They've had to look at their processes. They've had to re-engineer them. They've had to look at where work is done. Should it be done onshore or offshore? Should it be done with expensive people or cheaper people, more senior, more junior? Should we even be doing certain parts of our production process? And I find it untenable to think that law firms are not going to have to do the same thing. The oft-quoted, the oft-made statement that this is bespoke knowledge work. I don't think that's going to wash for much longer.
There are some questions in the survey about outsourcing,
Sure.
And we do seem to have seen there seems to have been a move recently when you look at Alan Overy and Herbert Smith going to Belfast, and you've got the push from Wales and etc. in Scotland, that first onshore and also firms to retain control rather than sending it to an outside supplier. And certainly one of the results that interested me from the survey was a fair amount of interest in firms outsourcing work to a fixed fee subsidiary. Is that something that you're coming across as a strategy that firms are considering?
I think I've certainly seen examples of associations, affiliations between one firm and another where firms are realizing that it's good to be able to say to a client that they can do certain types of work, but they don't necessarily do it in-house. Freshfields and Mills and Reeve in Cambridge, or DLA and what they've done with with Lawvest and Riverview, frankly, I think they're sort of good examples. But I don't necessarily think that outsourcing is the only way to deal with this by any stretch. I think there are ways for the firms to change their processes and use other resources that can really help them get to the same kind of outcome of lowering their input costs, as it were.
So we're not going to see Clifford Chance Light opening up in Wrexham, say?
I'm not sure, to be honest. Doesn't strike me as an obvious move.
No, it was just a concept that really jumped out at me. Something I hadn't really heard of before. Actually, law firms, large firms setting up a fixed fee subsidiary, presumably to put in all the lower value, more process driven work.
Yeah, well, they're setting up their own sort of onshore, near to London, kind of captive centres where they can send work, and that there clearly is lowering labour input costs, and also this idea that's brought out in the survey quite strongly, which is delegating work down, thinking through how we can, or how a firm can give more junior people more responsibility on projects. And I think clearly I would be saying this, but with a focus on information, good resources, I think it's perfectly possible for people to do that if you have good precedent banks, if you have good good notes, checklists, processes. I mean, the kind of things that you and I have spoken about before that Lexis PSL delivers to the market. I think those kinds of tools really do help firms delegate work down to more junior people.
Within a part of that also is going to be use of IT. Everyone talks about it. The survey shows strong support for the notion that they will be making more use of software to automate low-level process. And also, that caught my attention was online legal documents, which is something at the moment we think about in terms of the consumer market, really, with Rocket Law and LegalZoom and all the rest of it. But is it actually playing out in the larger firms as well, then?
Let me try and pull that apart. So I think just using more IT, I think is definitely, we see that. So if you think about the number of firms that are coming and talking to us either about implementing more sophisticated ERP type systems to really improve their ERP, so enterprise resource planning, so practice management, sophisticated practice management tools to really help them with sort of put in a better back office system, or they're coming and talking to us about case management solutions that really have layers of automated workflow. If X happens on a matter, then trigger an automated letter or trigger an email or so on. Firms come and talk to us a lot about that. So there's definitely an increase in automation there. And then I think also in drafting, so the use of document assembly or document automation in getting to first drafts. We've got a product, Lexis Smart, which uses business integrity sort of technology to do it. And people genuinely believe they can get sort of 50% plus time savings. That's the equivalent of having two people, obviously, if you're saving half your time. That's a phenomenal saving. So I think on that side, there is a story there. I think the second half of your question was about sort of white labeling or sort of producing documents direct to the market. I agree with you that perhaps at the top end of the market, it's not something we think about, and I'm not sure that LegalZoom and Rocket Law are attacking this particular segment. But Allen and Overy and Linklaters and others were some of the first people to think about automating documents for in-house counsel with their blue flag solutions and others, and it's certainly a need for general counsel. You hear them say, how can I stop answering so many questions for an NDA or for a standard terms and conditions? And if a firm can give them something that does that, then I think they're onto a winner.
And does everything become automated or commoditizable in the end? I've spoken to LPO providers who reckon in 10 years' time in India they'll be doing big M&A contracts.
Well, so I think, does everything become? No, it doesn't, because there's always judgment required in legal matters. But
the bulk of a document is, these documents are often pretty similar, a lot of boilerplate.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think lots of matters can be, when you start really asking the question, how do you break down a particular matter? There is a lot of repetitive work, or there is a lot of stuff which looks very similar to something else we've done. I mean, come on, those of us that have been lawyers, you know that what you do is you turn to a similar transaction and you pull that stuff. So if that is true, then one must be able to industrialize, to find process efficiencies. And so whilst I don't think you can get to a world where everything's going to be done offshore, because the big bucks are paid for good judgment, good legal and commercial judgment, I'm sure there is plenty to still be done between where we are now and where we might get to.
So the days of the red pen and the blue pen and all the underlining going back and forth from when I was a trainee back in the day, which rather discouraged me from a career in the law, I have to say.
Right.
That this kind of technology presumably is very much pushing that into the past.
Well, yeah. So yes, I think firms that have got good. This is our starting position, and it's not ridiculously disadvantageous to our sort of opponent in the deal, or the partner or the firm on the other side. That's just pointless. When you're only getting a fixed fee,
Yeah.
There is no point spending hours and hours and hours negotiating a pointless clause. You might as well start from a position you think is going to be pretty well accepted, and focus on the bits that are that are really up for grabs. And I think if firms really adopt that kind of position rather than just arguing everything for the toss of it, then I think you do get to a better place, a better outcome for everyone. And I think therefore having good suites of documents and having clause banks and having, we know this is a pretty standard position, or we know this particular bank or this particular client likes us to act in a certain particular way, so let's just go straight in with it. I think that kind of behaviour is going to become more prevalent. Yeah.
Well, we can move on smoothly now to fixed fees. There's clearly an appreciation, understanding, a resignation perhaps among firms that they're going to have to embrace fixed fees far more. I mean, are they really ready to respond to that challenge, or as Richard Siskin says, that most of the alternative fee arrangements he sees are just hourly rates in another form, and they've just been calculated on the basis of hourly rates as well?
So I think things have to change to really do fixed fee pricing, and I think it really comes down to understanding how your business works extremely well, having really understanding what steps are required in a particular transaction, understanding who needs to do that step, and therefore how long is it likely to take. And if you've got 20 hours of a particular type of person who has a certain input cost and 40 hours of someone with a higher input cost, you can start to get an understanding of how much this work's going to do. And I think for me, the way we look at it, one of the most exciting pieces of R&D we're doing here at Lexis is around some sort of process work, trying to break down complex transactions into process. And when we talk to firms in the market about it, they're quite interested, because I think they aren't necessarily thinking about doing that kind of work. For me, that's necessary for a firm to really understand how to price. And if you can understand what your costs are really well and what the profitability of certain types of work are, then you can start suggesting fixed fees. Because if you just come out with a number, you're going to take a bath when it turns out to be a harder piece of work.
Not if you double it.
No, okay. Not if you double it. That's I think I'll take a note of that. Future pricing strategy. Think of a number and double it.
So you kind of fall into the Siskin camp, if you like, that the future is of breaking down a piece of work into all its constituent parts, working out how each bit needs to be done, and then finding the most appropriate provider. I mean, he breaks down litigation, say, into about 9 tasks, of which only 2 really need to be done by the law firm.
Yeah, I think broadly I am, yeah. I think I can hear almost the cacophony of noise coming from the market saying, but that's unrealistic. But despite the fact that these are complex knowledge, this is complex knowledge work, these are complex transactions, not everything's as complicated as people want to make out. And I think that in every kind of transaction there are pieces that are simpler or more process driven. And I think the first place to start is with those. And then as firms and as the market gets more confident on those pieces, you can start to attack the next level of work, which is perhaps takes a little more thought to work out how to unbundle it and deconstruct it. But overall, yeah, I think I am in that camp. It's the industrialization of law, and as I said earlier on, I think every other industry's had to deal with it. I don't see why the law is going to be immune to it.
So a lot of what we've talked about has been about law firms understanding what they do and how they do it. Are they the ones you see really looking at that, investigating it, or are they kind of just stumbling into this because in response to all the pressures from the economy, from General Counsel, from ABSs or whatever? How strategic are they being in their own thoughts?
I think there are some examples of firms who are doing it well, but in the main I think there's still quite a long way to go. And that's why I think if you go right back to some of the stuff at the beginning, I think it was surprising to me that firms seemed so confident, because to me it looks like there's a lot of uncertainty ahead, and that the next few years are going to be equally choppy. Some people will do well, others will find it very difficult. There's going to be new entrants, things are going to change, and I think it's incredibly interesting, certainly. I don't think it's going to be particularly easy.
No, someone should set up a website about it. Nick West, thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil.